Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV, which is the second part of a two-part series on the history of the opera. And in today's video, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the Romantic and modern eras of opera. In the previous video, part one that you can check out, we talked about Baroque and classical opera. This look at opera is meant to be sort of an introduction, a surface view of the genre over a period of a lot of years. So we're not going to get into like really minute specific detail. I just want to offer you a basic understanding of the genre. In the last video, we mainly focused on Italian and French and German operas, and we are going to keep talking about those today. However, I did want to start today's video with a look at English opera, because we didn't talk about that at all last time, and then later in the video, we'll touch a little bit on Russian opera. Most of the early English operas were written in Italian style, like Henry Purcell's famous Dido and Aeneas from 1689. He really loved opera seria as a genre, and he tried to popularize it in England, but he didn't really succeed because he died young. Once he passed, so did England's interest in opera. In England, opera started to catch on again with Thomas Arne, who was the first English composer to write comic operas, and he even wrote them in the English language, like with the opera Thomas and Sally in 1760. Arne also experimented with serious opera in the mid to late 1700s to great success. Handel, another well-known English composer in the Baroque period, also wrote Italian-style operas in England for London audiences. There were other great Italian composers that became popular in England as well, like the operas of Mozart and Beethoven. So that's the Baroque and classical era. Now we want to take a look at the late classical and early Romantic eras, where you had the Bel Canto Style, the development of grand opera, and the master composer Verdi. Bel Canto literally means beautiful singing, and it's a really intricate and florid opera style that basically requires a master singer to perform it. Bel Canto was really all about making a melody sound as beautiful and amazing as possible, as opposed to making the melody, expressive or dramatic. And there were people who were really against this style, like Gluck, who we talked about in the previous video, and Wagner, who we're about to talk about shortly, who thought that Bel Canto style was devoid of emotion and they preferred to put more drama into it. But there were guys like Rossini and Mozart who really embraced Bel Canto style. An example of Bel Canto writing style is Rossini's Barber of Seville, which premiered in 1816. And it's been brought to my attention that I can't actually link videos on the screen itself that you can click through, which is unfortunate. I think YouTube used to let you do that. But anyway, I will leave you a link to the associated blog post for this. So all the videos that I'm going to be talking about, all the clips, all the excerpts, you can go find on that blog post. So anyway, The Barber of Seville is described as one of the best comedy operas of all time. And you've probably heard of it, if not actually seen The Barber of Seville. The particular scene I'm going to link to is Una voce poco fa, if I pronounce that correctly. It's an aria from the first act. One thing we talked about in the previous video is that the French had their own version of opera, and they basically resisted Italian influence for a long time. But by the time the early 1800s arrived, the French started to give way into Italian Bel Canto style, especially when Rossini brought his opera William Tell to Paris in 1829. William Tell's an example of an emerging style of opera called grand opera, which we'll discuss in a moment. Jumping back to Italian opera, the opera style that followed Bel Canto was grand opera. Grand opera was popular in the 1800s, and they were really large in scale, so hence the name grand. They were a lot like other romantic music genres, very big, very bold. They usually involved 4 to 5 acts, huge casts, big orchestras, and flashy stage effects and design. Grand opera works also tended to be about events in real-life history, sort of like how opera seria as a genre tended to be about mythological subjects. Giuseppe Verdi was one of the French revolutionaries who helped change the course of opera from the highly virtuosic and florid Bel Canto style to the bigger, more dramatic storytelling style of grand opera. He wrote many famous operas that are still performed today, but Rigoletto was particularly revolutionary in that it blurred the lines between arias and recitatives, so that there was less distinction between the two. And then, which we'll talk about in a moment, his opera works culminated in Don Carlos, which is considered one of the greatest French grand operas. Don Carlos was a grand opera by Verdi, which premiered premiered in 1867. It's basically just a quick summary here. It's based on the life of Carlos, the Prince of Asturias, in the 1500s and the conflicts that he faced. The excerpt that I'll link to you on the blog is the king basically singing about Beware the Grand Inquisitor, who's a character of the story. It's a really moody and dramatic song, and it's a good example of the changes in opera that occurred in the mid to late 1800s. After Verdi and grand opera, the style of verissimo emerged at the end of the 19th century. This is basically like a post-romantic style that was fixated on realism. So instead of operas being about like really fantastical topics and almost magical topics, it was a focus on like the grittier day-to-day stuff, something like, for example, poverty. A good example of this style is Puccini's Madama Butterfly, which is a tragic story about an American man and his Japanese wife. So what I want to link to and what I'll show you on the blog post is a famous aria, Un bel dì vedremo, One Fine Day We Shall See, from Act 2. And this is all about Butterfly waiting for her absentee husband and longing for him. And it's a really beautiful tune, and the language is really poetic, but what makes this more true to its era is that the subject matter is much more day-to-day than previous opera styles. It's like real people's lives. We've already been spending some time discussing Italian opera in the mid to late 1800s, which was more or less considered the golden age of opera. But now I want to take a look at German opera and discuss one of the most famous names in opera and music of all time, Wagner. But first, we gotta start with the background and Mozart. So Mozart was critical to developing the German form Singspiel and bringing it to larger audiences, like with the magic flute, which we talked about in the previous video. So Mozart's Singspiel was really important to set German opera apart from Italian opera, and was a really crucial influence for Wagner. Mozart then passed the torch to Beethoven, who wrote only one opera, Fidelio, and this is largely because Beethoven agonized over it for around a decade before it finally premiered. After that, we step into the Romantic era with Carl Maria von Weber, who took German opera in an even further direction from Italian by defying the prevailing Bel Canto style. An example of this is The Free Shooter, which is considered the first important German romantic opera. It was based on a German folk legend, and it's really stark, expressive, and dramatic. You can take a listen to that if you want, but what this is really leading us into is Wagner. Richard Wagner was one of those people that you either loved or you hated in like a passionate way. There's not very many people who are like, meh, Wagner, he's okay. He really inspired very strong, distinct, passionate emotions in the people who listened to his music. Part of that was because Wagner stirred the pot of music and of music history. He really challenged the preconceived ideas of what music should be. He challenged harmonic conventions, and he really just did things in his own way, leaving everyone else behind to decide if they liked it or not. Anyway, Wagner's approach to music was bigger is better and all or nothing. He followed Weber in the chain of German operatic lineage, and he started a new concept of opera called Gesamtkunstwerk, which is basically, it means a complete work of art. This was Wagner's way of merging all of the arts into one performance, like music and poetry and literature and painting. He was also a fan of like huge and prominently placed orchestras in his operas. So if you take a look at like the Ring Cycle operas, there's 4 of them, you'll see that the orchestration is a huge part of the opera. Wagner was also totally comfortable defying any type of musical convention if the emotion or the mood of the moment called for it in his story. He thought the story was much more important than the, keeping specific pitches and tones. Another thing that he did in many of his operas, like the Ring Cycle that we talked about and we'll talk about more, is he blurred the line between arias and recitatives so that his operas can tend to sound like just this endless stream of melody. Wagner was so passionate about his own vision and doing things in his own way that he even built his own opera house at Bayreuth, which was exclusively used for performing his own works in his own way. Wagner's Ring Cycle is a 4-part opera series written between 1848 and 1874. Now, if they're played all together, the runtime is about 15 hours, and the way Wagner intended them to be heard was together in sequence, like one for each day. Though, I guess nowadays you could binge watch them like a Lord of the Rings trilogy or something, and kind of a similar theme, actually. Kind of like an early version of Lord of the Rings. The Ring Cycle is massively complex and features mythological stories centering around a magic ring that can grant the bearer dominion over the whole world. Again, sort of like Lord of the Ring. Since the orchestra he used was so large and so intense, he used his own opera house, which we looked at already, to help the singers, because the way it was designed helped the singers' voices project over top of the instrument so they didn't strain their voices. And the link that I'm going to share with you in the blog post is from the Funeral March. And I think this is a really good example of how epic Wagner was, and also how moody and how dark. Now let's hop over to France and talk about the most famous French opera comique of all time from 1875, and that's Carmen. Carmen was really innovative in that it blended the expressivity of romantic operas with the more modern style of like adding a hefty dose of realism. Carmen was a slow burn of success. It wasn't immediately loved. It was a little too different for that, but eventually, the French came to realize how brilliant the music was and how forward the story was. Basically, the story is about a beautiful girl named Carmen and a soldier named Don Juan, and they fell in love, except it was kind of crappy because Carmen later decided she wasn't in love after all, and she pushes Don Juan away, and he's completely smitten, and bad stuff happens. So what I want to link to you in the blog post is the really famous habanera aria from the first act. You'll almost definitely recognize the famous melodic chromaticism. It's a really cool melody. And what this song is doing is establishing Carmen, like the woman, as the dominant force of the story. French opera also gave us a completely opposite counterpoint to Wagner, and that was Debussy. In Debussy's operas, one thing that he did that was very different was would have these kind of endless recitatives, because he, again, was blurring the line between arias and recitatives. So where Wagner did the same thing and had these unending melodies, Debussy did the same thing but had these like unending recitatives. And Debussy did, like Wagner, favor the orchestra and used it a lot, but in a completely undramatic and atmospheric way, whereas Wagner was more about like big, bold effects. Debussy was much more subdued. Meanwhile, there's Russia. So just like England at the beginning of this video, we haven't really talked about Russia at all in this series. We've mainly been focusing on the major European players like France and Germany and Italy. But that's not to say that Russia was just like sitting around twiddling their thumbs while all of this is going on. So I did want to really briefly discuss Russia's role in opera. Italian operas were enjoyed in Russia throughout the 1700s, and it wasn't until the 1800s when Russian operas really came to develop their own identity. A composer named Mikhail Glinka composed A Life for the Tsar in 1836 and Ruslan and Ludmilla in 1842. A Life of the Tsar was based on a real-life Russian war story and tied in with the growing rise of Russian nationalism that appeared in life as well as other artistic genres. This opera was structured just like a typical Italian opera, but what was different about it and made it more Russian is that it included some Russian folk music, and it also had that Russian nationalistic identity. So that then paved the way for other Russian composers such as Tchaikovsky to further develop the Russian identity of their operas. The Queen of Spades, which was written by Tchaikovsky and premiered in 1890, is an example of a really successful Russian opera, and it ties a little bit into Glinka's operas in that it was inspired by them, because Tchaikovsky loved Glinka's operas as a boy, and he spent a lot of time meticulously studying A Life for the Tsar as well. I'll leave you with the prelude from the Queen of Spades in the blog, because it displays Tchaikovsky's inherently Russian instrumental style. It's very sweeping and expressive, and it grows really large about halfway through. It's really cool, so make sure you listen to the whole thing. With Tchaikovsky and Wagner, we reach the end of the 1800s, and then we step into a new and more modern era with composers that we're going to talk about, such as Puccini and Strauss. We recently did a video on modernism in music, so if you want more information about what we're about to talk about here, definitely check it out, because we're just going to briefly touch on it. So one major movement of modernism was atonality. So basically what this means is it's music that doesn't feel anchored in a key, which kind of gives us this uneasy, floating feeling. Wagner was really the start of this atonal movement in opera, and it continued and was developed with guys like Strauss and Debussy and Puccini. They loved their dissonance, and they loved freedom from harmonic conventions. After Wagner came Strauss, who took Wagner and Verdi's ideas in a new direction. So one example of this is Salome from 1905, which is a German opera based on a French story by Oscar Wilde. And it was really controversial upon its release because it was really weird and dark. But aside from that, like it blended Christianity, death, and eroticism all into one weird package. And his opera Elektra was pretty similar in this regard. And musically, he took tonality, or lack thereof, to new and kind of scary places. In Salome, the most controversial scene is called the Dance of the Seven Veils, which I'm going to link to on the blog. It's basically an early 20th century striptease. It's Salome dancing to the Oriental-inspired music while removing each of the seven veils, and opera sopranos at the time actually refused to dance that part because it was just so risque, and instead they had a stand-in do it for them. Further into the 20th century, we get even more experimental with Schoenberg's atonality. You have Stravinsky's modern take on classical music, like neoclassicism. And even if we talk about guys like Philip Glass, who had a minimalist approach to music, we won't talk about him today, but those are some examples of how music became more experimental. Modernism in opera started with Schoenberg and his student Berg, who were based in Vienna and were big fans of atonality. Die glückliche Hand, The Hand of Fate, by Schoenberg was first performed in 1924 and was partly autobiographical, meaning he wrote it about himself in part, which was a new development in music. And the story is all about how man makes the same mistakes over and over. This opera was categorized as a drama with music as opposed to an opera, even though it's in the same kind of broad category, and it's only 20 minutes long. You can check out the full audio recording over on the blog, as with all the others. The influence of atonality spread far and wide to England with Benjamin Britten and to Russia with Rachmaninoff and Shostakovich. But since atonality was really weird, it inspired a musical backlash and a revival of a more classical sounding writing style, which is where neoclassicism entered the picture. Stravinsky's opera Oedipus Rex from 1927 is a good example of this classical revival style. Throwing back to ancient Greek stories and sung in Latin, but narrated in the performer's language, it's a blend of new, well at the time, and old. And now we circle back to English opera, which had some large successes in the mid-1900s, such as Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes from 1944. It was just as successful as some famous Italian operas by Puccini, like Madama Butterfly, and Britten's works are performed regularly even today, which is pretty rare for post-war operas. And let's not forget the United States, because in the 1900s, we had guys like Leonard Bernstein and George Gershwin writing English operas that blended modern American music styles like jazz with traditional operatic styles. Though Bernstein was much more well known for his musicals, like West Side Story, for example, he did write a few operas as well. But who could forget Gershwin's famous 1934 opera Porgy and Bess? It was amazing. It broke down boundaries by featuring a cast of classically trained African-American singers, and it debuted on Broadway, and it resulted in the first integrated audience that Carnegie Hall had ever had in 1936. So all about that boundary breaking. One song that I'm going to link you to in the blog is Summertime, and it's a really great and really often covered song. Totally worth checking out if you don't want to watch all 4 hours of Porgy and Bess. So as a final evolution of opera, or like who knows what the future holds, but for where we're sitting right now, we have musicals like the aforementioned West Side Story by Bernstein. But there's tons of other musicals that you've surely heard of. We don't even really need to spend time talking about it today, like now I can't think of any off the top of my head, like Phantom of the Opera or Passion or Sweeney Todd. And even some of the more modern musicals like Rent carry on the particular operatic traditions, like, say, for example, using recitatives instead of just like purely being spoken word and other things like that. The awesome thing about musicals, both modern and a little bit older, is that they're much more digestible to people nowadays, to modern audiences, whereas opera is sometimes a difficult pill to swallow, especially if you have no context for what you're watching. So, big fan of musicals. That's about where this video is going to end today. Thank you so much for watching today's part 2 video on opera. I really hope that I was able to give you some kind of context and overview, and maybe even you'll like watch Carmen or one of the other operas we've talked about and decide that you're cool with opera or that you like it. Let me know in the comments if you have any ideas for future videos. I always like reading your suggestions and your comments. Thank you to everyone who helps make these videos possible, for all of you who give these videos likes, and all of you who have subscribed and continue to be wonderful humans. Thank you a bunch, and I'll catch you in the next video. Now let's hop over to Now let's